It was a warm afternoon in the city. The sun hung high in the sky, and people were walking through the park, enjoying their lunch breaks and soaking in the day. In one corner of the park, near the benches, a homeless man sat on the grass. He had a scruffy beard and worn-out clothes, his face showing signs of hardship. He wasn't bothering anyone. He was just trying to rest, hoping for some peace amidst the busy world around him. The homeless man had been in this park many times before. He had seen it change with the seasons. During the summer, it was full of families having picnics, kids running around, and people walking their dogs. In the winter, it was quieter, but still, he managed to find a spot where he could get some warmth from the sun. Today, like most days, he had no real place to go. His thoughts wandered as he looked at the people passing by, lost in his own world, hoping for a few kind words from a stranger, though he never received them. On the other side of the park, a police car slowly pulled up. The officers inside glanced out the window, looking at the homeless man. There was no particular reason for them to stop, but they did. They exchanged words, keeping an eye on him, perhaps out of suspicion or maybe simply out of habit. Officers patrolled the park regularly, and they were trained to watch out for anything unusual. They didn't always see the people who were really struggling, they just saw what seemed like a problem that needed to be handled. One of the officers, a younger man named Officer Thompson, was new to the city and still learning the ropes. He looked at the homeless man for a moment, then at his partner, Officer Martinez, a veteran who had seen it all. "Do you think he's okay?" Thompson asked, his voice unsure. Martinez didn't respond immediately. He just stared out of the window, watching the man for a few moments longer. "We need to keep an eye on him." "You never know," Martinez replied. The words were casual, but there was a hint of caution in his tone. They had dealt with people like him before, people who didn't fit into society, who didn't have a job or a home, and often, who didn't follow the rules. In their eyes, the homeless man might as well have been another source of trouble. Officer Thompson nodded, still unsure, but his partner's confidence helped. The two of them got out of the car and started walking toward the man. Their boots made a soft thud against the pavement, and the sound carried through the quiet air of the park. The homeless man heard them approaching but didn't move. He was too tired to care or to even look up. The officers stopped a few feet away, their shadows falling over him. "Hey," Officer Thompson called out, trying to sound friendly. But his voice wasn't exactly warm. It was stern, more of an order than a greeting. The homeless man lifted his eyes slowly, not surprised, but tired. He had seen enough police officers in his life to know what was coming. He didn't respond right away, just stared at them, his mind trying to process whether he should say anything or not. "Are you okay?" "You're not supposed to be here," Officer Thompson said, glancing around. "Move along." The homeless man blinked a couple of times, his tired eyes struggling to focus. He wanted to say something, to tell the officers that he was just resting, that he wasn't causing any trouble. But words were hard to find. He had been through this too many times before, and his mind wasn't as sharp as it used to be. "Sir, I asked you a question," Officer Thompson pressed, taking a step closer. "Do you have ID?" The homeless man sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I don't have anything," he mumbled, barely audible. Officer Martinez, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. He had seen situations like this before where people didn't cooperate, where they wouldn't move, where things got tense. And he wasn't in the mood for dealing with another complication. "Move," Martinez ordered, his voice hard and final. There was no patience in it. The homeless man didn't respond immediately. He just looked at them, not sure if he should get up or just stay still. "Hey, I said move," Officer Martinez shouted, his voice much louder now, drawing the attention of a few nearby park goers. The homeless man's eyes widened. He hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly. Slowly, he began to rise to his feet, his body aching as he stood up. His hands were trembling, and he looked around, confused. It wasn't just the officer's words, it was the way they spoke to him, like he was nothing more than a problem to deal with. He had become used to being treated this way, but it didn't make it any easier. The tension was growing between them. The homeless man wasn't moving quickly enough to please the officers, and Officer Martinez, already annoyed, wasn't about to wait for him to figure it out. "Come on," he barked, pushing the man's shoulder roughly. It wasn't a gentle nudge, it was an aggressive shove that sent the homeless man stumbling back. At that exact moment, something shifted. A figure in the distance had been watching the whole scene unfold. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and walking with the kind of presence that demanded respect. He was wearing a simple jacket, but there was something about the way he moved, his alertness, his focus on every detail around him. This was no ordinary passerby. The man's eyes were locked on the interaction between the officers and the homeless man. He had been trained to assess situations in an instant. His mind moved faster than most, calculating every possible outcome. The man, though retired, was a former Delta Force commander. He had served in the military for years, protecting the nation, making life and death decisions on a daily basis. But now, he was just an ordinary citizen, trying to live a peaceful life. Or so he thought. He wasn't about to ignore what was happening in front of him, not when he could see how quickly things were escalating. He could sense the tension in the air, the unease in the homeless man's movements, and the anger in the officers' voices. The commander could tell the situation wasn't right. This was about to get worse. With purposeful strides, the commander walked toward the group, his mind already racing through how to handle the situation. He wasn't here to fight or argue with the police. But he also wasn't going to stand by and watch something that didn't need to happen. He wasn't the kind of man who could turn away when he saw injustice, not after everything he had been through in his life. The officers, noticing his approach, looked at him for a moment, confused. He wasn't a uniformed officer, and he wasn't someone they recognized. But his presence was enough to make them pause. The commander's eyes locked onto the homeless man for a brief moment. There was something in the man's expression, fear mixed with exhaustion, the kind of look that made it clear this wasn't just about this moment. It was about everything that had led him to this point in life. He wasn't just a homeless man, he was someone who had been pushed to the edge and was now just trying to survive. The commander stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his words carrying the weight of someone who knew what he was doing. The officers exchanged a quick glance, unsure of how to respond. They were trained to deal with situations like this with force, but there was something about this man, this stranger, that made them hesitate. They didn't know who he was, but they could tell he wasn't just anyone. As the commander took another step closer, the situation became clear. It was about to take a very different turn. The tension in the park was palpable. As the officers continued to stand over the fallen homeless man, their hands still holding him down, everything seemed to slow down. The sound of the birds in the trees, the distant chatter of the park goers, and the hum of the city around them all faded into the background. What had just been a routine encounter had turned into something far more serious, and neither the officers nor the homeless man knew how it would end. The homeless man was struggling to breathe, his chest rising and falling with every shallow gasp. His body trembled, not just from the fear but from the physical toll of the situation. His arms were pinned to the ground by the officers, and the pressure of their weight on him made it even harder for him to catch his breath. It was clear that he wasn't in any condition to fight back, yet the officers continued to hold him with the same force, as if they still viewed him as a threat. Officer Thompson, still new to the force, glanced down at the homeless man with uncertainty in his eyes. His partner, Officer Martinez, was focused and unflinching, his training kicking in as he maintained control of the situation. But Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had been in similar situations before, but this one felt different. The homeless man hadn't resisted in a way that justified the force they were using. He hadn't done anything that warranted being treated like this. "Sir," Thompson said, his voice shaking. "Can you breathe? Are you okay?" The homeless man didn't respond, his eyes wide with fear. It was clear that he couldn't speak, let alone answer. His body was stiff, and his hands twitched as though trying to escape the pressure on his chest. "Get up!" Officer Martinez barked, his tone hard and final. "Now!" But the homeless man didn't move. It wasn't that he didn't hear the command, he simply didn't have the strength. He wanted to get up, to comply, but his body was telling him otherwise. His muscles were sore, and his mind was clouded with confusion and panic. He didn't know what to do, so he lay there, helpless. "Move him," Martinez ordered, his patience wearing thin. "I'm not gonna ask again." Thompson hesitated for a moment before following Martinez's lead. They both attempted to drag the man to his feet, but it wasn't easy. The homeless man's body was limp, and his movements were weak. It was clear that he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Thompson felt a pang of guilt in his chest, but he pushed it aside, focusing on what they had been trained to do. In their minds, this was just another part of the job, another problem to solve. But to the homeless man, this wasn't just a job. This was his life. The situation was escalating quickly. The officers' voices grew louder, more impatient, and the homeless man's fear became more palpable. It wasn't hard to see that this was no longer a simple encounter, it was becoming an all-out confrontation. The homeless man was no longer just an individual who needed help. To the officers, he had become a problem that needed to be controlled. At that very moment, a figure in the distance caught sight of the scene. The commander, who had been walking through the park, stopped in his tracks. He had been hoping to have a quiet day, but something about the way the officers were handling the situation didn't sit right with him. There was no reason for things to escalate to this level. He had seen enough violence in his life to know when things were spiraling out of control. This wasn't the kind of situation that required force. The commander, though retired from his position in the Delta Force, still carried the confidence and training of someone who had spent years in high-stakes situations. His body moved with purpose, his instincts sharp. He wasn't just another passerby, he was someone who could sense when something wasn't right. And what he saw before him was wrong. He approached the scene, his eyes scanning the officers and the homeless man, calculating everything in an instant. The officers hadn't noticed him yet. The homeless man was still on the ground, struggling to breathe, and the officers were too focused on what they were doing to realize that help was coming. The commander didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, moving through the park with determination. When the officers finally noticed him, they froze for a moment. They had been so focused on the homeless man that they hadn't seen the approaching figure. As the commander drew nearer, Officer Thompson instinctively took a step back, his hand hovering over his radio. He wasn't sure who this man was, but there was something about him, something that made him pause. "Who are you?" Officer Martinez asked, his voice less harsh than before but still filled with authority. He had seen a lot of things in his time, but there was something about the stranger that made him uneasy. The commander didn't immediately answer. He stood still for a moment, his eyes locking with Martinez's. There was no doubt in his mind that these officers were not handling the situation properly. They were treating the homeless man like an object, not a human being. His military training had taught him that a person's life was always more important than a task, and he knew that what was happening here could spiral out of control in an instant. "Step aside," the commander said, his voice calm but firm. He wasn't asking for permission, he was giving a command. Martinez hesitated, his hand still resting on his radio. He wasn't sure what to do. The commander didn't look like someone who could just be ignored. There was an authority about him, something that made Martinez uneasy. But he couldn't show weakness, not in front of his partner. He squared his shoulders, trying to maintain control of the situation. "I said, step aside," the commander repeated, his voice now sharper. He didn't have time for games. Thompson, who had been standing back, finally spoke up. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice softer now, the uncertainty in his tone clear. He wasn't sure why he was asking. It was clear that the situation was spiraling out of control, but something in the commander's eyes made him want to listen. "This man needs help," the commander said, his gaze shifting to the homeless man, who was still struggling on the ground. "Not force. He's not your enemy." Martinez glanced down at the homeless man, still unsure of what to do. The situation had gotten complicated in ways he hadn't anticipated. But before he could speak, the commander moved closer to the homeless man, kneeling down beside him. The commander's presence was like a weight lifting from the man. He was no longer just a homeless figure on the ground. Now, he had someone standing up for him. The commander's voice was calm, reassuring. "You're okay," he said to the homeless man, his words offering a moment of comfort in the chaos. Officer Martinez stood there, unsure of what to do next. The situation was no longer in his control. The commander had taken charge, and there was nothing he could do to change that. It was clear to him now that this wasn't just a routine encounter. It was a turning point, not only for the homeless man but for everyone involved. "Let me know if you need any adjustments or further expansion." The commander knelt beside the homeless man, his voice low and calm, offering a sense of reassurance. The officers stood back, still trying to process the sudden shift in control. Officer Martinez's stern expression had softened, but he was still unsure of what to do. This wasn't how things usually went. In his experience, when the police were called to a scene like this, they took charge, and the situation was handled quickly and decisively. But now, it felt like the entire script had been thrown out the window. The homeless man, still lying on the ground, looked up at the commander with confusion in his eyes. His breathing was shallow, and his body trembled with the effort to stay conscious. He was scared. It wasn't just the officers who frightened him, it was the entire situation. He had lived through so much, and every day was a battle to survive. But now, something was different. The commander's presence offered him something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of safety. "Take it easy," the commander said, his hand gently resting on the man's shoulder. "You're not alone." The homeless man blinked, his eyes fighting to stay open. He had heard those words before, but they had never meant anything like they did now. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone was treating him like he mattered, not like a problem that needed to be fixed. Officer Thompson, still standing a few feet away, watched the interaction with growing curiosity. He had always been taught that the police were the authority in any situation. They were the ones who were supposed to control the scene, to make sure everything was handled according to the law. But the commander wasn't following any of the usual rules. He wasn't pushing the homeless man around or shouting commands. He was speaking to him like a human being. And it made Thompson question everything he had learned about how to handle these kinds of situations. "Who are you?" Officer Martinez asked, his voice now more neutral than accusatory. The commander had taken control, and Martinez had no choice but to acknowledge it. He was still trying to figure out who this man was and why he had stepped in so quickly. The commander's eyes remained fixed on the homeless man, but he answered calmly. "I'm someone who believes in doing things right." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "You don't solve problems like this with force. You solve them with understanding." Martinez blinked, a little taken aback. The idea of understanding rather than force wasn't one he had considered in this type of situation. But as he looked at the homeless man, he couldn't deny that the commander had a point. This wasn't a situation that required aggression, it required compassion. "Is this how you normally handle things?" Martinez asked, still unsure whether he was being challenged or simply offered an alternative perspective. The commander didn't immediately answer. He continued to kneel beside the homeless man, his eyes focused on the man's condition. He could tell that the homeless man was struggling, but he wasn't in immediate danger of losing his life. That was something, at least. But the longer this went on, the more he knew that the real danger was in how they treated him after this moment. Would they simply walk away, leaving him to fend for himself again, or would something change? "No," the commander said finally, his voice firm but not harsh. "This is how it should be done." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was silence. The officers looked at one another, unsure of how to respond. They had never been asked to consider a situation this way before. They had always been told to assert their authority, to take control. But now, they were being asked to pause, to reconsider everything they thought they knew about how to handle people in vulnerable situations. The homeless man, still lying on the ground, closed his eyes for a moment. His body felt heavy, like it didn't belong to him. The world around him seemed to spin, and he fought to keep his thoughts from drifting. But there was something different about the way the commander spoke to him. Something about his voice made him feel like he wasn't just a burden to be managed. He was a person, a human being who deserved respect. Thompson took a step closer, feeling an odd mix of hesitation and curiosity. He had always been taught that the police were the ones in charge, that their word was final. But here was a man who wasn't a police officer, yet he had stepped in and taken control of the situation. He wasn't pushing anyone around. He wasn't demanding compliance. He was simply offering understanding. "I don't understand," Thompson muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" The commander turned to face him, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "Because no one deserves to be treated like this, especially not someone who's already fallen on hard times." Thompson felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The commander's words cut through him like a knife. He had never really considered the people he interacted with on the streets as human beings in the way the commander described. They were just part of the job, people to be moved along, removed from public spaces, or dealt with quickly and efficiently. But now, hearing the commander's words, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important. These weren't just faceless individuals, they were people, just like him. Officer Martinez looked at the commander, his expression unreadable. He had been doing this job for years, and he had seen all kinds of people. He had seen them at their best and their worst. But this was different. This wasn't just about doing the job, it was about doing it the right way. And for the first time, he began to see the homeless man not as a problem but as a person who deserved dignity. The commander, sensing the shift in the officers, spoke again, his voice soft but firm. "You may not agree with me now, but I'm asking you to think about it. What if we treated people like this every day? What if we saw them for who they really are and not just for their mistakes or their struggles? What if we helped them, instead of making them feel like they don't matter?" The words hit hard, and for a moment, there was no response. The officers stood in silence, unsure of what to say. The homeless man, still lying on the ground, opened his eyes and looked up at them, his expression one of quiet curiosity. He had been in this position before, with people looking down at him, judging him, dismissing him. But now, something had changed. It was small, but it was there. He wasn't invisible anymore. Officer Thompson took another step closer, his voice uncertain. "What do we do now?" The commander stood up, brushing the dirt off his pants. "We help him," he said simply. "We get him the care he needs." The officers nodded, their initial resistance giving way to a new understanding. They still had a job to do, but for the first time, they were seeing it through a different lens. The days following the incident were filled with questions and uncertainty. The homeless man, though physically recovering from his injuries, still felt the weight of the situation. The moment he had been treated like a human being, like someone with value, was something he would never forget. But now, it wasn't just about him, it was about what came next. The whole city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen after the controversial incident in the park. The commander's involvement had sparked a shift in the community's mindset. People from all walks of life began discussing the event, sharing their opinions and offering solutions. It was more than just about one man being shot or one police officer making a wrong decision, it was about how the system could be improved. The commander had made his stance clear: treating people with dignity and respect should be the foundation of any law enforcement interaction. And now, the question was, would anything change? The homeless man, whose name was now known to the public as Marcus, was struggling to adjust to his newfound attention. He had never expected anything like this. Before the incident, he had been invisible to society, just another face in the crowd, another person no one really saw. But now, the world seemed to be paying attention to him. His story had made headlines, and people were learning about his difficult past, how he had lost everything, how he had tried to rebuild his life, and how he had ended up living on the streets. For many, Marcus's story resonated deeply. It was a reminder that anyone could find themselves in his shoes, and that no one should be dismissed or treated unfairly because of their circumstances. But even with the attention and the support, Marcus wasn't sure what to do next. His body was healing, but his mind was still racing. The shock of what had happened, the fear he had felt when the officers had pinned him to the ground, still haunted him. It wasn't just about the physical pain, it was the emotional toll that was harder to shake. He couldn't stop thinking about how easily things could have gone wrong, how a moment of misunderstanding could have ended his life. The commander, meanwhile, was more determined than ever to push for change. He was in the public eye now, and he knew that this was his chance to make a real difference. He had seen the power of reform in the military, how small changes in approach could lead to big improvements. And he believed that the same could happen with law enforcement. But he also knew that change would not come easily. It would require more than just words, it would require action, collaboration, and a willingness to confront difficult truths. The commander began meeting with local officials, community leaders, and even the police department. He didn't just want to point out what was wrong, he wanted to help create a solution. He spoke about the importance of empathy and de-escalation training, of teaching officers to understand the human side of every situation. He wasn't suggesting that law enforcement should be less strict or less vigilant, he was simply advocating for a more balanced approach. In his eyes, every officer needed to see the people they interacted with as individuals, not just as problems to be solved. As the commander continued to speak out, more and more people began to listen. The city council agreed to hold a series of public meetings, where citizens could share their thoughts and concerns about police practices. The atmosphere was tense, but also hopeful. It was clear that there was a deep desire for change, but there was also fear that things might not improve, fear that the system was too broken to fix. The commander knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face whatever came next. Meanwhile, Marcus found himself at a crossroads. He had been given a second chance, a chance to start over, but he wasn't sure how to take it. He was still living in the shelter, still trying to piece his life together. But something had changed within him. The commander's words had made him realize that he wasn't just a victim of his circumstances, he was a person with a future. He didn't have to accept the life he had been handed. There was more to him than just the label of homeless man. And for the first time in years, Marcus felt like he had the strength to fight for himself. With the support of community organizations and some of the people who had rallied behind his story, Marcus began to take small steps toward rebuilding his life. He attended job training programs, started therapy to deal with the trauma of his past, and began to connect with others who had experienced similar struggles. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks and days when it felt like he was back at square one. But there was also progress. Slowly but surely, Marcus was finding his way. The city, too, was changing. The commander's push for reform was gaining traction, and police officers were beginning to realize that they couldn't just rely on their authority to get things done. They needed to understand the people they were serving. They needed to learn how to de-escalate tense situations and recognize when someone was in distress. The idea of community policing, where officers worked alongside community members to solve problems, was being discussed more and more. It wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about building trust and respect. As the months went by, the police department began implementing new training programs. Officers attended workshops on empathy, conflict resolution, and mental health awareness. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it didn't fix everything overnight, but it was a step in the right direction. The community began to notice the difference. There were fewer complaints about police brutality, and more people felt comfortable approaching officers with their concerns. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was progress. Marcus's story became a symbol of that progress. He had gone from being a homeless man who had been treated like a problem to someone who was working to rebuild his life and make a difference. He wasn't just a victim anymore, he was a survivor. And his story showed that with the right support, people could change, no matter how difficult their circumstances. The commander, too, saw the impact of his efforts. As he watched the changes taking place in the city, he knew that he had made a difference. But he also knew that the work wasn't over. The real test would come when the next crisis hit, when the next person was in need of help. Would the system hold up? Would the lessons learned be applied in real situations? For now, though, things were improving. The city was becoming a better place, one where people were treated with dignity and respect, where the police and the community worked together to create a safer, more compassionate environment. And for Marcus, that meant hope, a hope that his past didn't have to define his future, that he could be more than just the label the world had given him. The incident had left the city shaken. News about the shooting spread quickly, and before long, people from all over were talking about it. The image of the homeless man lying on the ground, surrounded by officers, was burned into the minds of many. But what really caught people's attention was the man who had stepped forward, the retired Delta Force commander who had witnessed everything unfold. In the days that followed, the commander's involvement became the focus of a larger conversation. He wasn't just a bystander, he had become a symbol of justice, someone who had stood up when it mattered the most. His actions were seen by many as a much-needed wake-up call, a reminder of the importance of holding people accountable for their actions, especially those in positions of power. The officers involved in the shooting were placed on administrative leave while an investigation began. They were questioned about what had happened, about the force they used, and why things had escalated the way they did. For the first time in a long time, there was real scrutiny on the way the police handled situations involving the homeless and those who seemed to fall outside of society's view of acceptable. The commander, however, wasn't content with just witnessing the aftermath. He knew that this wasn't just about one man's life or about one bad decision made by a few officers. It was about a larger issue, something that needed to be addressed if things were going to change for the better. He became an outspoken advocate for reform, calling for better training for police officers, especially when it came to dealing with vulnerable individuals. He didn't believe that every situation required force. He believed that with the right approach, most conflicts could be de-escalated without anyone getting hurt. As the investigation continued, the city began to see protests and rallies calling for justice. People from all walks of life came together, demanding accountability for the officers involved. Some were angry, some were sad, but all of them wanted answers. And for the first time in a long time, it seemed like the voices of the people were being heard. The homeless man, whose life had been changed forever, became part of the conversation too. While he had been the victim of the shooting, his story began to emerge as well. People learned that he wasn't just some faceless person on the streets, he had a life before he ended up where he was. He had once had a job, a family, a home, but through a series of unfortunate events, he had lost everything. His story resonated with many, and it served as a reminder that anyone, no matter their circumstances, could end up in a similar situation. In the weeks that followed, the homeless man began to heal physically. His injuries weren't as severe as they could have been, but the emotional scars would take much longer to fade. He was still recovering, both physically and mentally, but he had something he hadn't had in a long time: a sense of hope. He realized that, despite everything, there were people who cared, people who were willing to stand up for what was right. And that gave him the strength to keep going. The commander, who had initially been just a witness, became a key figure in the calls for police reform. His words carried weight, especially given his military background. He wasn't someone who just talked about change, he had seen what it took to make real change happen. He had led soldiers into battle, made life or death decisions in high-stress situations, and now he was speaking out about the importance of protecting and respecting every life, regardless of their status in society. He spoke about the need for empathy, for understanding, and for a better approach when it came to law enforcement. He called for a system that didn't rely on force as the first solution, but instead emphasized communication and de-escalation. He urged the police to see people for who they truly were, not just as threats or problems to be solved. And his message was heard. Slowly, but surely, the conversation began to shift. There were meetings between the police department and community leaders, discussions about how to improve training and change policies. It wasn't going to be an easy fix, but it was a start. People knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but they also knew that it was necessary for the future. The city was changing in ways no one could have imagined just a few months ago. People were more aware of the struggles faced by the homeless and the marginalized. The issue wasn't just about the shooting anymore, it was about the larger systemic issues that had been ignored for far too long. People began to realize that it wasn't enough to just point fingers at one incident and move on. The problem ran deeper, and it required a deeper solution. In the end, the homeless man's life was forever altered. But it wasn't just because of the shooting. It was because his story had become part of something bigger. His name was now known, and with it, the story of his hardships, his struggles, and his journey. He became a symbol of the forgotten people in society, the ones who often went unnoticed. His experience was a reminder that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter their circumstances. For the commander, the journey wasn't over either. He knew that there was still much work to be done. He had made his stand, but he was just one person. Real change required a collective effort. It was going to take time, but he believed it was worth it. He wasn't interested in glory or recognition. He was interested in making sure something like this didn't happen again. He wanted to see a world where people didn't have to fear for their lives just because they were in a vulnerable position. In the years to come, the commander would continue to speak out on behalf of those who couldn't speak for themselves. His work was far from over, but he had made a difference. And in doing so, he had shown that one person's actions, no matter how small they seemed at the time, could spark a movement and bring about real change. The city would never forget what had happened. The homeless man's life, the commander's intervention, and the protests and calls for justice were part of the city's history now. It was a story that would be told for years to come, not just as a reminder of a tragedy, but as a story of hope, change, and the power of standing up for what was right.